Hey everyone! The channel has been doing really well lately, and I truly appreciate every single one of you who watches the videos, sends in your stories, and continues supporting the channel. It honestly means a lot to me. I've also been working on a few things behind the scenes recently, which is why I haven't been able to reply to comments as often as I normally do. But I do see them, and I genuinely appreciate all the support and feedback you guys leave. I'm going to start responding to more of your comments very soon, so if you've been waiting for a reply, I promise I'm getting to them. Thank you again to everyone who has sent in stories and continues to support the channel. Now, let's get into tonight's story. There's a certain kind of quiet that only exists around old roadside motels late at night. It's difficult to describe unless you've actually worked somewhere like that. After a certain hour, the traffic fades away, and everything begins to feel strangely suspended, like time itself has slowed down. The motel was called the Shoreline Rest, which always sounded much nicer than it actually was. It sat just off a two-lane highway outside a small beach town that mostly survived on summer tourists. During the day, the place looked ordinary enough. Sun-faded walls, a few palm trees planted along the parking lot, and a small office with a glass window and a little bell sitting on the counter. But once night fell and the road emptied out, the whole place started to feel different, like the kind of place people only stopped at when they didn't really have many other options. I had taken the job because it was simple, and the hours fit around some other things I was trying to work on at the time. The night shift mostly meant sitting in the office, handling late check-ins, answering the occasional phone call, and keeping an eye on the parking lot to make sure nobody caused trouble. There were 12 rooms in total, all lined up in a straight row facing the asphalt. The office sat slightly off to the side, which meant I could see most of the doors through the front window. Most nights were uneventful. A truck driver might pull in, or maybe a couple passing through town would rent a room for the night. People usually arrived exhausted, checked in quickly, and disappeared inside their rooms until morning. That night, sometime around 10, I had the office window cracked open because the building never cooled down properly after baking in the sun all day. At some point, a car pulled into the lot. Just a normal car, nothing unusual about it. The man who stepped out looked like someone you wouldn't notice in a crowd, completely ordinary. He walked into the office and asked for a room for one night. His voice was calm and casual, no strange behavior, nothing that made me uncomfortable. I handed him the registration form, and he filled it out quickly. I remember briefly glancing at the name, but it didn't stick with me afterward. People checked in all the time, and by morning I usually forgot most of them. I gave him the key to room 7, which sat about halfway down the row of rooms. Nothing about the situation seemed unusual. He took the key, walked back to his car, grabbed a small bag, and went inside. If things had stayed that way, I probably wouldn't remember him at all. But about 20 minutes later, I noticed him outside again. From the office window, I could see him standing a few steps away from his door, looking toward the entrance of the parking lot, like he was waiting for another car. People step outside for smoke breaks or phone calls all the time. That wasn't strange. But he didn't seem to be doing either of those things. He just stood there with his hands in his pockets, staring toward the road. Then about 15 minutes later, he came out again. Same thing. He walked a few steps into the lot and looked toward the highway like he was expecting someone to arrive. Maybe he was meeting someone late and didn't want to fall asleep before they showed up. The pattern kept repeating. He would go inside for a while, then come back out and stand there watching the empty road. This went on for hours. At one point, I stepped outside the office just to stretch my legs and check the vending machine near the ice maker. While I was out there, I saw him again, standing in roughly the same spot. He glanced over at me, but didn't say anything. I gave him the kind of nod people exchange when they acknowledge each other without actually starting a conversation. He nodded once in return, then shifted his attention back toward the road. The whole situation carried this quiet tension that I couldn't quite explain. It wasn't aggressive, it wasn't threatening. It felt more like someone waiting for something important and growing increasingly restless as time passed. By the time it got close to 3 in the morning, the highway had gone completely silent. That's when another car entered the lot. What made it strange immediately was the headlights. They weren't on. The car rolled slowly into the lot from the road, guided only by the faint glow of the motel sign and the overhead parking light. The man from room 7 stepped away from his door almost instantly, like he had been waiting specifically for that car. He walked straight toward it before it had even fully stopped. From the office window, I could see the driver's side window lower slightly. The man leaned down and spoke to whoever was inside. The conversation couldn't have lasted more than 30 seconds. There was no yelling, no visible argument, just a brief exchange that I couldn't hear from where I was sitting. Then the man stepped back. The car rolled out of the parking lot the same way it had entered, slowly and still without its headlights on. I remember watching it disappear down the road and thinking how strange that was. When I looked back toward the row of rooms, the man from room 7 was already walking back inside. The rest of the night passed quietly after that. I never saw him come out again. Around 6 in the morning, the sky started getting lighter and my shift was nearly over. Most guests were still asleep at that hour, so I didn't bother checking the rooms yet. The day shift employee arrived around 7:30, and we talked for a few minutes while I finished some paperwork. I casually mentioned the guy in room 7 stepping outside a lot during the night, just a passing observation. Then, about 20 minutes later, the housekeeper knocked on the office door. She said the room looked empty, but the key hadn't been returned. That happened occasionally. Some guests left early and forgot to drop their keys in the box, so I walked over with her just to take a quick look. The door to room 7 was slightly open. The first thing I noticed was the bed. It looked completely untouched. The blanket was still pulled tight the way housekeeping leaves it after cleaning. The small bag I had seen him carry inside was sitting on the floor near the desk. But the strangest thing was the trash bin. It was filled with torn pieces of clothing. Not just one shirt or something small. It looked like someone had taken multiple articles of clothing and ripped them into strips. There were pieces of a shirt, part of a jacket sleeve, sections of jeans. On the desk, we found the rest of his belongings, his phone, a wallet, and a folded local map, the kind you can pick up at the gas station down the road. The map had circles drawn around several locations in pen. Every single one of them was a graveyard. Not the same cemetery over and over either. Different graveyards scattered across the surrounding area. I remember the housekeeper looking at me and saying, "Why would someone leave their phone behind?" And she was right. People don't usually walk away from their phone. The police were called later that morning after the motel manager reviewed everything. They collected the belongings and asked us a few questions about what we had seen. I told them about the car without headlights and the short conversation in the parking lot. As far as I know, they never identified the driver. But the strange part didn't end there. A couple days later, one of the convenience stores down the road contacted the motel because their security camera had recorded something unusual. The footage showed the man from room 7 walking along the roadside sometime after 3 that same night. He wasn't wearing a shirt, and he looked like he was talking. Actually, that's not quite the right way to describe it. He was walking at a normal pace, occasionally turning his head the way people do when they're speaking to someone beside them, except there was no one there. The camera angle was clear enough that if another person had been walking next to him, they would have appeared in the frame. But the footage showed only him. At one point, he even paused, like he was listening. Then he responded again, as if someone had just spoken. The police investigated it for a while, but eventually the whole case faded into an unsolved missing person report. Then I started hearing things. It began with small noises coming from room 7 during my shifts. At first, it was subtle, a faint sound of movement, sometimes a dull thump against the wall. Other times, it sounded like footsteps shifting slowly across the floor. The first time it happened, I walked over to check the door. It was locked. The room hadn't been rented since the incident. I stood there for a few moments, but the noise stopped almost immediately once I got close. A few nights later, it happened again. This time, it sounded like a chair scraping across the floor. I remember feeling a strange hesitation before opening the door. Inside, everything looked exactly the same as it had since the cleaning crew reset the room. The bed was neatly made, the curtains were halfway drawn, nothing appeared disturbed, but the air inside the room felt strangely heavy. The noises kept happening. Some nights they started around 2 or 3 in the morning. One night I heard a loud bang from the wall and decided to step inside again. I had barely made it halfway into the room when something suddenly felt wrong. That's the only way I can explain it, like a sudden pressure building in my head. The next thing I remember clearly was waking up on the floor. My coworker from the morning shift was kneeling beside me asking if I was okay. Apparently, he had arrived early and found me lying there inside the room. He said I had been completely unconscious. I told him I must have fainted from standing up too quickly or something like that. But the truth is, I had no idea what had actually happened. After that, I refused to step inside room 7 again. The noises continued occasionally, though not every night. Sometimes it sounded like someone pacing slowly back and forth. I never stayed close enough to figure out where the sounds were coming from. A few months later, the motel began losing business. A newer place opened further down the highway, and most travelers started staying there instead. The remaining guests slowly disappeared. Eventually, the owner shut the entire motel down. The last time I drove past it, the parking lot was cracked and weeds were pushing up through the asphalt. The neon sign had gone dark. Several of the windows were boarded up. Room 7 was still there in the center of the row, looking exactly the same from the outside. And sometimes I still wonder what really happened to that man, whether he was truly alone that night, or if something else had been walking beside him on that road after the car left. Something about the smell of burned fireworks still brings this memory back to me, even now. It's strange what your brain decides to hold on to over the years, but that particular smell always takes me straight back to the small room I used to rent near the beach. At the time, I was working a pretty forgettable job, unloading deliveries for a small supply warehouse a few kilometers inland. It paid just enough to cover rent and food, and honestly, I didn't really need much more than that back then. The room I was staying in belonged to an older couple who had built a handful of small rental units behind their house. They were simple concrete rooms lined up in a row with thin walls and basic furniture. What really made the place nice, though, was the location. If you walked down a sandy path behind the property for about 5 minutes, you'd reach the beach. It wasn't a busy tourist area either. Most of the time it was quiet, almost peaceful. There was a stretch of scrubby trees and bushes between the rentals and the shoreline that people in town casually referred to as the beach forest, even though it wasn't dense enough to really qualify as a proper forest. Still, once the sun went down, that area became surprisingly dark. I had fallen into a simple routine during the months I lived there. Work during the day, pick up food from a small takeaway place on the main road, then head back to my room for the evening. It was a quiet, uncomplicated kind of life, and honestly, I didn't mind it. One evening, I remember getting back later than usual because the warehouse had fallen behind schedule. By the time I got off the bus and walked the rest of the way down the road, it was already dark. The streetlights didn't reach the rental property, so the final part of the walk was always a little dim unless the moon happened to be out. The couple who owned the place had gone away to visit family for a few days, and two of the other renters had moved out earlier that week. I think there might have been one other person staying there, but I rarely saw them. As I came through the gate and started walking toward my room, I noticed movement near the back of the property, right where the bushes met the sandy path leading down to the beach. At first, I thought it might have been a dog or some kind of animal because it happened so quickly. But then I realized it was a person. Someone suddenly ran out from behind the bushes in the backyard area and moved quickly along the side of the property toward the darker section of trees. I only caught a glimpse of them for a second or two. It was too dark to see their face or even clearly tell what they were wearing. What stood out, though, was the way they were moving. They weren't just walking. They were moving fast, the way someone runs when they're trying to get out of sight as quickly as possible. For a moment, I wondered if maybe one of the other renters had brought a friend over and they were leaving. But that didn't quite make sense. They hadn't come from the direction of the rooms. They had come from behind the property, from the direction of the bushes and the trees. At the time, though, I shrugged it off. I didn't want to overthink it. Weird little things happen around beach towns all the time. People take shortcuts through properties or walk across yards without thinking much about it. There was also a faint smell in the air, and it took me a moment to recognize it. It reminded me of the smell you get after someone sets off a firecracker, that sharp, smoky scent. Not exactly like a campfire, more metallic and sudden. I remember actually stopping for a second and sniffing the air again because it felt a little out of place. There wasn't anyone nearby lighting fireworks or anything like that. It was just a random weekday night. Still, I figured maybe someone down on the beach had set something off and the wind carried the smell up toward the property. Living near the ocean, smells travel in strange ways sometimes. So I went inside, locked my door like usual, and didn't think much more about it. Over the next few days, nothing unusual happened. In fact, I almost completely forgot about the person I had seen running that night. Looking back now, I kind of wish I had paid closer attention. A few nights later, I was sitting in my room pretty late. I had the window open because the fan in that room wasn't very powerful, and the sea breeze helped keep things cooler. It must have been close to midnight when I heard something outside. Just a faint sound, like footsteps on sand or gravel. I paused what I was watching and listened carefully for a moment. The property usually became very quiet at night, so even small sounds carried pretty clearly. At first, I assumed the other renter had come back late. That wouldn't have been unusual. But the footsteps didn't sound like they were heading toward the row of rooms. Instead, they seemed to be moving along the back edge of the property, close to the trees. Eventually, curiosity got the better of me. I walked over to the door and opened it slowly, just enough to look outside. That's when I saw someone standing near the edge of the trees. They weren't very far away, maybe 15 or 20 meters from where I was standing, just far enough that the shadows from the branches partially covered them. The strange part was that they weren't moving. They were simply standing there, facing in my direction. I could tell they were looking toward the row of rooms. For a moment, I wondered if it might be someone who had gotten lost or was trying to find a specific room. I almost called out to ask if they needed help, but something about the way they were standing made me hesitate. It's difficult to explain exactly what it was. They just didn't behave like someone who belonged there. Before I could decide what to say, everything happened incredibly fast. There was a loud crack somewhere to my left. For a split second, my brain didn't even understand what it was. It sounded like something snapping or popping nearby. Then, suddenly, a sharp pain hit my leg. I remember stumbling backward into the doorway because it happened so unexpectedly. At first, I actually thought I had tripped or slammed into something, but when I looked down, I saw blood running down my pant leg. That's when I realized something was very wrong. Almost immediately after that, another man came running past the front of the rooms from the direction of the trees. He moved so quickly that I barely had time to react. As he passed through the faint light from the yard, I saw that he was holding a gun in his hand. He didn't even glance at me. He just sprinted straight across the property and disappeared down the sandy path toward the road. The person who had been standing near the trees was gone as well. I remember leaning against the doorframe, trying to make sense of what had just happened. By that point, my leg hurt badly, and the blood was coming out faster than I expected. The realization slowly sank in that I had been shot. Not directly targeted, at least that's how it felt afterward. It seemed more like I had accidentally stepped into the middle of something I wasn't supposed to see. I managed to grab my phone from the small table inside the room and call emergency services. The operator had to ask me to repeat myself a few times because I was still trying to process what had happened. The paramedics arrived and quickly helped stop the bleeding before loading me onto a stretcher. Later, I learned that the bullet had passed through the lower part of my leg without hitting the bone. Apparently, that was extremely lucky. I stayed in the hospital for a couple of days while they monitored everything. During that time, the police asked me a lot of questions about what I had seen. Unfortunately, I couldn't give them much useful information. It had been too dark to clearly see the faces of either man. All I could really tell them was that one person had been standing near the trees, and another man ran past me with a gun. The officers also asked about the night a few days earlier when I had seen someone running behind the property. At the time, I wasn't even sure if it was related, but they wrote everything down anyway. In the weeks that followed, I started hearing a few things from people around town. Nothing official ever came out about exactly what had happened, but there were rumors circulating that certain parts of the coastline were being used by people involved in illegal transport operations. Not the kind involving goods or smuggling alcohol, the kind involving moving people secretly from place to place. You know, women. Apparently, the area with the trees behind the rentals connected to a stretch of beach that wasn't monitored very closely at night. Whether that's actually what those two men were involved in, I never found out for sure. The police never caught them, at least not while I was still living there. Once I recovered enough to walk normally again, I decided it was probably time to move somewhere else. The owners of the property were very apologetic, even though none of it was really their fault. You know what's strange, though? How random the whole situation was. If I hadn't opened the door at that exact moment, I probably never would have been involved in any of it. I would have just heard some noise outside and gone back to watching something on my laptop. Instead, I ended up with a scar on my leg, one that still aches occasionally whenever the weather changes. There's a stretch of river behind the town where the old docks start to thin out and the trees begin creeping closer to the shoreline. Most people who live there know exactly the area I'm talking about. During the day, it looks normal enough. Just weathered wooden platforms stretching over the water, a few small boats tied up and rocking gently with the current. Nothing about it seems unusual. But at night, it feels completely different. Once you move past the last working dock, there's almost no lighting at all. The glow from town fades behind you, and the riverbank starts to feel isolated in a way that's hard to describe. I used to walk there pretty often when I lived in that town. It wasn't really for exercise. It was more of a habit I picked up on nights when I couldn't sleep. The place I rented was a small upstairs unit above a bait shop near the marina. On some nights, I'd just feel restless, like I needed to get out of the room for a while. The river was only a couple minutes away, so I'd throw on a jacket and wander down there to clear my head. One thing about river towns is that they get quiet early. After about 10 or 11 at night, most people are already inside. The only sounds you usually hear are the water pushing against the docks and the occasional knock of a boat rope tapping against metal. It always felt calm, like the whole town had slowed down and taken a deep breath. That night wasn't supposed to be any different. It had been warm all day, but the temperature dropped quite a bit after sunset. The air carried that damp river smell that clings to your clothes and skin. I walked past the brighter marina lights and kept heading toward the darker stretch where the docks start getting older and more uneven. The path along that section follows the forest line for a while. On one side, you've got the river and the creaking wooden docks. On the other side, there's just trees, brush, and patches of tall grass. It's not a deep forest exactly, but it's thick enough that once night falls, you can't really see very far into it. I had walked that route enough times that I didn't think much about it. I was moving slowly, hands tucked into my pockets, listening to the quiet sounds around me, the water shifting against the docks and the wood creaking softly beneath my feet. At one point, I stopped and leaned against the railing of one of the docks, just staring out across the dark water. That's when I first heard the voice. At first, I assumed someone else had come down to the river. Sometimes fishermen show up early, or people cut through the path while heading home from town. But something about the voice felt immediately strange. It sounded like someone speaking quietly to themselves, soft talking. The words were impossible to make out. I couldn't understand anything clearly. It was just the sound of someone murmuring under their breath. And the sound wasn't coming from the river. It wasn't coming from the docks either. It was coming from the trees. The strange part, the thing that made my stomach drop, was that the voice sounded familiar. Not vaguely familiar, like when a stranger reminds you of someone. I mean, it sounded exactly like someone I had known when I was younger. The tone, the rhythm, even the quiet, mumbling quality in the way they spoke. For a moment, I actually thought someone from town had followed the path behind me. But when I turned around, the docks were empty. The marina lights were far down the shoreline, and there wasn't anyone walking in my direction. The voice kept going. Soft, steady, almost like someone quietly reading something or thinking out loud while they spoke to themselves. I tried listening harder, trying to pick out actual words, but every time it felt like I was about to understand something, the sound slipped away again. That's when the memory started creeping into my mind. There had been a man who lived next door to my family when I was a kid. He was an older guy, quiet most of the time, always working in his garage. And whenever he was fixing something, he would talk to himself. Not loudly, just soft, muttering under his breath. I hadn't thought about that man in years, but the voice coming from those trees sounded exactly like him. And that didn't make sense, because that man had died when I was about 12 years old. I stood there for a moment, telling myself my brain was just playing tricks on me. Rivers do strange things with sound. Voices can travel oddly over water or bounce through trees in unexpected ways. But the longer I listened, the worse the feeling became. Eventually, I stepped off the dock and moved slowly toward the dirt path that ran along the forest line. The voice was definitely coming from somewhere inside those trees. The brush there is thick enough that you can't just see straight into it. Mostly it's just dark shapes and tangled branches overlapping each other. And then suddenly, the voice stopped. It cut off all at once. When you're near a river at night, there's usually constant background noise. Frogs, insects, the sound of water shifting against wood. But in that moment, it felt like everything had gone silent at the same time. That was the point when my instinct started telling me it was time to leave. I took a step backward toward the dock path, already planning to head back toward the marina lights. I didn't want to mess around with whatever might be hiding in those trees. But then, something moved above me. I looked up. Even now, I still have trouble describing exactly what I saw. My brain couldn't really process it at the time. There was a shape high up in one of the trees, resting on a thick branch, maybe 15 or 20 feet off the ground. At first glance, it looked like a person. The size seemed about right, maybe a little taller than average. But the posture was wrong in a way that's difficult to explain. The figure was crouched along the branch, as if it were balancing there, except the limbs didn't look positioned in a way that made sense for someone trying to stay balanced. I stared at it for several seconds, trying to convince myself I was looking at a person who had somehow climbed up there. I couldn't see a face. It was too dark, and the leaves blocked parts of the shape. But I could see the outline clearly enough to know one thing. It was looking straight at me. When people balance on a tree branch, they usually shift a little. They adjust their hands or move their weight. This thing wasn't moving at all. It was just perched there, watching. I felt that cold kind of fear you get when your body realizes something is wrong before your mind fully understands it. Then the voice started again. Except this time, it wasn't coming from deeper in the forest. It was coming from the figure in the tree. The same quiet talking I had heard earlier, only now it was clearly coming from above me. The voice still sounded like that man from my childhood, and I still couldn't understand a single word. That was the moment my brain stopped trying to explain things logically. I turned and began walking quickly back toward the docks. At first, I forced myself not to run. Part of me was afraid that if I started running, whatever was behind me would start chasing me. But after maybe 10 seconds, I heard something shift again in the trees. That was enough. I started running. The boards along the dock were uneven in places, and I nearly slipped a couple of times because I wasn't watching my footing. I just kept moving toward the faint glow of the marina lights. I never looked back. I was too afraid of seeing something following me. The strange thing is, I never heard footsteps behind me. At that point, I was shaken, but still trying to convince myself I had misunderstood what I saw. Maybe it had been a person sitting in the tree pulling some kind of prank. And maybe the similarity in the voice was just my brain making connections that weren't really there. But later that night, something happened that made me realize the situation might have been more serious than I thought. I woke up around 3 in the morning feeling extremely nauseous. At first, I assumed it was something I had eaten, but within an hour, I could barely stand without feeling like I was going to collapse. My head was pounding, and my vision felt strange, like everything on the left side looked slightly dimmer than usual. The sickness got worse over the next 2 days. Eventually, I went to a doctor because the weakness just wouldn't go away. My left eye had started losing clarity, almost like I was looking through fog. They ran a bunch of tests, but no one ever gave me a clear explanation for what caused it. One doctor suggested it might have been some kind of neurological inflammation, maybe triggered by a virus or extreme stress. But the timing always bothered me. I had been perfectly healthy before that night by the river. After that experience, I was sick for weeks. Even once the nausea faded, the weakness stayed with me for a long time, and my left eye never fully recovered. The vision improved eventually, but it's still noticeably worse than my right eye. I moved away from that town about a year later. For a long time, I tried to convince myself I had exaggerated the memory of what happened that night. It's easier to believe your mind misinterpreted something strange in the dark. But the part that still sticks with me is how familiar that voice sounded. Not like a stranger, like someone I had known a long time ago. Someone who definitely shouldn't have been sitting in a tree beside the river, quietly speaking in the dark.